Hello everyone and welcome to Two Car Pros. My name is Ryan and today we're going to be showing you how to determine back spacing, front spacing, and overall rim width for a aftermarket rim purchase. So you can go from this ugly old rim from the 60s to something a little more modern. This guide will also work on more modern vehicles. I just happen to be using it on a 1967 Camaro, but this also applies to a 2020 Camaro as well. So before we go any further, I also want to mention that I'm focusing primarily on the rear rim and tire combination because the fronts are usually a little more typical. And as long as you keep your ratio intact, which I talk about later, all the geometry for the suspension and steering lines up properly, and you don't have a very hard to steer or weird feeling car, because that's exactly the opposite of what you really want. And don't worry too much about your tire selection. That's something you and your rim shop are really going to go into detail for. I tried to order some stuff online. I tried to make online things work, but it was really tricky to use any kind of online resource. What I would do is go into your local rim and tire shop. I used a place called Tucker Tire. Big shout out to those guys over there. They helped me out an immense amount. Very straightforward, very professional. I like them a lot. If you're anywhere in Orange County, California, check out Tucker Tire. Big thumbs up from me. They helped me every step of the way, and actually my rims were done way quicker than they thought because the rear rims did have to be custom, and the front rims you could actually found off shelf. Now if you're going for a custom rim, those, once they're ordered, they cannot be returned or anything. You own them. Keep that in mind as well. If you can order off shelf, I believe those can be returned and exchanged, so don't be afraid. If you're not quite happy with a rim that you could get off shelf and not custom made, don't be afraid to talk with your rim shop about trading those for something a little bit different, as long as you don't take the stickers off the tires. I believe that's the way that works. It's really a personal preference how big you want your rim as well and how much tire tread you want. You can see that these tires are the same height, basically. I think this one's maybe a ½ inch shorter, but the amount of meat on there, the profile, is much thinner on the tire on the right because the rim is going from a 14 to a 17 for the rear. That is something to take into account, and that, again, that's personal preference. This is a very universal guide. It doesn't pertain to any particular vehicle, just anybody who's looking for a different offset on your rims, and maybe you've heard that term offset before and have no clue what it means. I'm going to teach you in this vehicle. It's not very scary. It's very simple and straightforward. It's something anybody could do at home in your garage. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Alright, first things first when we're judging back spacing on a rim is we're going to take a look at the old rim. This is the stock rim off of my 1967 Camaro. That's the vehicle we're going to be using here today. And when we're measuring back spacing on rims, it's a good idea to start from your stock rim because the geometry is all correct right from the factory, which is super cool because that's really important, and we'll mention more of that later on in this video. So you're looking at the back side, and this surface here is our flange mounting surface. This actually faces inboard into the car, and what I have mounted on top of that is just a combination square completely zeroed out, so I get a good measurement. Now, when we're measuring back spacing, you want to go to this gold mark I've made here with a paint pen, because that is your actual rim width, because this area here above the gold mark is all the way to what's called the flange height. And back spacing doesn't include your flange height, only your rim width. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So you want to grab a piece of string or a thin wire. This is actually a little bit on the thick side, so I'm going to have to account for that. And measure from that gold mark in the background. It's a little bit trickier to show on film because it kind of looks like the gold mark's really high, but I'm measuring where my thumbs are, basically where that gold mark is, and we can account for that and look down on our combination square here. So we want to hold this down, compensating for our flange height and only measuring our rim width. And we can see that it's pretty much dead on 3 inches. So we know that our stock back spacing is in fact 3 inches. So again, we have our gold mark here compensating for our flange height because we are only dealing with rim width. It's whenever you're measuring anything, it's always in rim width. Ignore the flange completely. Okay, so the next thing we need to measure is actually the total rim width. And the way we're going to do that today is putting a flat surface behind the flange mounting surface here. So it's actually on a jar of peanut butter, which is kind of funny. But it's a good flat surface, and the tire can sit on top of it, and it's no big deal. Now, there's 2 ways to do it, the way we're doing it now, or you can remove the tire from the rim and measure it that way, but I understand if you don't want to do that, it's kind of a pain in the neck, and this is a lot easier, and we can do this now without a tire removal machine, which pretty much nobody has. What we can do is see our gold mark there that is indicating the end of our rim measurement. Always using your rim measurement, never including your flange measurement when you're doing rim measuring or rim depth measuring. And we can stretch our wire here. A thinner piece of string would work a lot better, but we're making good what we have. So we're going to pull that tight around where we think the diameter of the rim, where the width of the rim ends. So we're going to hold that tight and drop down in our ruler so it's nice and flat on that surface, and we can see that it is right at 2 inches. So we know the total rim width is 5 inches because 3 backspacing and 2 front equals 5. So we know that it's 2 in the front and 3 in the rear. And the final thing we need to cover when it's coming to measuring our rim for reference is to determine how wide or the diameter of the rim is. And if there's a tire on, it's pretty easy. It'll say it right on these numbers. Like right here, it says R14. We know it's a 14-inch rim. But if it doesn't have a tire on there, it's understandable. So we can go ahead and measure that. Okay, so when you're measuring your rim diameter, always make sure that you're accounting for the rim thickness just inside there, because you're measuring basically where the tire bead is, not where the flange is here. It needs to be just where my measuring tape is now sitting. And see that it is 14 inches from your the diameter of the rim, accounting for the flange. So it is in fact 14 inches. So what you're looking at now is the rear end of my 1967 Camaro, and what I've done is rigged a square with some vice grips and a towel on the stud there to protect the threads. It's squared on the flange surface so I can visually see that plane all the way up to where the rim is basically going to be. So now we can measure. So right here, my hand is the most shallow part of the fender well. That's basically going to be limiting how much backspacing we can do. And there's 2 things you need to know about that. You need at least 1 inch clearance from the wheel to the fender well, and then another inch on top of that to account for the convex of the tire bulge. So we can take our measuring tape and find what our maximum can be, and we can see that it's pretty much dead on 5 inches, so 2 inches in, our back spacing is 3 inches for the rears. Now I'm on the other side of our rig here, and the really cool part about using the square with measurements on it is it's measuring from this surface, which is our flange surface, so we can determine our front spacing, and it has nice measurements on there, and it looks like we can get away with about 5.5 inches of front spacing, because we have to account for that extra inch, and that'll clear the fender well there. And these are all matters of opinion as far as this goes. I want the tire to be able to be tucked in over here just in case the suspension bottoms out. And I mean, you can go crazy. I mean, you can go all the way over to here if that's your preference. It's just your tire might hit your fender lip here, and I don't want that. And that's all a matter of opinion and taste, but to be safe, I'm gonna go ahead and do 5.5 inches of front spacing on my rears. So this is what the fruits of our labor look like. Our total rim width on stock and rear, because the stock rims are all the same, is 5 inches, 2 in the front, 3 in the rear. And all the rims are facing to the left in this diagram with a 14-inch total diameter, which isn't good enough for us, so we're going to be using our modded here, which is 7 inches total, 3 in the front, 4 in the back, and 16-inch in total diameter. And you determine that basically by eyeballing with a measuring tape and seeing that it'll fit. And you want to make sure that when you're doing backspacing, that you're going to clear your tie rods and stuff like that. Make sure that your rim is big enough to fit over your brakes if you have like a disc brake conversion, or if it's on a more modern vehicle. You have to keep the backspacing and front spacing equal. So our stock one was 2 and 3. So if you're going to add 1 inch to the back, you have to add 1 inch to the front. We did that. We have 4 and 3. We're at 7. And obviously you can play around with the fractions if you don't want it quite that wide. But always keep that relation identical, adding 1 to 1 here and here for your fronts, because if you don't, it won't steer correctly, and the vehicle will generally feel cruddy to drive, and that's not what we're going for here. And we've determined that a 16-inch rim would be appropriate. Now on our rear, it doesn't really matter what you do as far as your back spacing and your front spacing. These can be totally different in the relation. You can put 3 on the front, 4 on the back. You can kind of, you know, play it fast and loose as long as you're within your wheel well of your desired wheel well spec. So we determined 5.5 for the front spacing, 3 for the rear with a 17-inch rim, because we want the rear tires to be a little bit bigger. That's 8.5-inch wide rim. And we made sure to give enough berth for the tire bulge on the front and the rear. So now I want to go over a comparison of our old tire to our new one and why you might want to do this. So more tire equals more traction equals more better. That's pretty obvious, and we can see how much wider the tire on the right is compared to the stock tire on the left, and how shallow the front spacing is versus how deep the front spacing is on the aftermarket rim. And that's basically for aesthetics as far as the rear wheel is concerned. And then we can look at the back spacing. It's 4 inches on this one and 3 on this one. So we get a more recessed wheel here. And we can see that the tire height is basically the same. So we're not really changing the ride height, which is good. I didn't want to change that too terribly much. I just wanted a wider tire and a much more aesthetically pleasing rim. And the tire is an NT 555 G2 285/40 ZR17 104W. If you know what all those tire numbers mean, they can be pretty confusing. So here's what our final product looks like on our car and what our measurements did. So we can see that our tire is just about, maybe 1.5 inches from the body of our car. You probably could have gone another 1/2 inch back spacing and been fine. But the reason we were measuring our back spacing so generously is because that gap right there, we don't want this tire rubbing on that gap, and that is going to close. Let's say our left side of our car actuates up this way, but our right wheel over there goes down. What that's going to do is take the tire and make it do this. So if that rubs on the inner fender well enough, bad things can happen, especially if you have thin sidewalls. And I just don't want to mark up my nice 1967 body, and I don't want to hear the noise either. So I'd rather have a little bit more gap than not enough. And we can see that our custom-made rim here is nice and deep. It looks very nice on our car. 17 inches was a good measurement. I didn't want it looking too terribly modern. I mean, a little updated, obviously, because they didn't have these bigger rims back then. What you want to look out for is make sure there's enough room here between your tire and your wheel well, and obviously the suspension comes down about 1 inch with weight on it. But I'm actually really happy with how much they stick out, which is, it's kind of tricky to see on camera, which is not at all. It doesn't stick out past here. Originally I wanted this to be kind of tucked up into here if necessary, but the suspension firmness is going to prevent that from ever bumping up against there. And honestly, I wasn't going to get a tire wide enough, which is what I wanted. So that's an 11-inch wide tire on a 9-inch rim. Even though earlier in the video I said 8.5, they would only let me do 9, so I figured let's do 9. And it worked out for me, and that's gonna come down to who's ever custom making your rims. If you have custom rims like this one is, on our rear here, these are custom made American Racing Torque Thrust 2s. So how deep this plane is actually all custom, but this part here is made by American Racing. And then a rim shop attaches and makes this weld here on the back for our 3-inch back spacing, because 3-inch back spacing and 4-inch front spacing is kind of weird. Because our front and back spacing ratio is kind of weird. I had to get these rims custom made, but it's comforting to know you can get them custom made, which is really cool. So our front rims don't match our rears. These are 16-inch, and I don't have the fenders on my car right now due to installing some things on the firewall. Anybody who has a GMF body, Gen 1 will know what I'm talking about. And like I said earlier, you just want to make sure that it clears your tie rod connection there and your brake calipers, which this does perfectly. Because if you had more back spacing, look how close you would be to the tie rod connection there. So that's something you want to keep in mind, because you could have even more back spacing, have a crazy wide front tire, but then this would be an interference fit with the tie rod, and you don't want that. And also the upper control arm. Want to avoid that as well. Luckily, these are off the shelf. They had these exact 4-inch back, 3-inch fronts available, and they're very, very cheap. Not too bad at all, and they just fit on just perfectly. Unfortunately, due to them being different rims, the tires are technically different, but they look similar enough, and that would be my tire shop hooking me up for that. So that's pretty much it, and you've seen what it looks like on my car, and I can't be happier. Again, I could have made the back spacing on the rears a little bit wider, But honestly, I'm pretty happy with the end results. I don't know if I would do that, go any wider. You could if you really want to push it, again, personal preference, but I like that extra little gap there just in case the suspension undulates in a funny way when going in and out of driveways. You really want that assurance there that it's not going to rub. At least I don't. I don't want my wheel wells all marred up by the rubber, and technically there's a chance that the sidewalls could pop because they are pretty thin due to the type of tire that they are. Thank you so very much for watching. If you like me, you like what I do on this channel, consider joining down below. Otherwise, please subscribe and like this video. Thank you a bunch for watching, and I'll see you next time.